Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're completely flipping the script on how you think about influence. If you've ever felt like you're just, hitting a brick wall when trying to change someone's mind, well, you are absolutely in the right place. We're going to move away from that exhausting idea of pushing a heavy rock up a hill. Instead, we're going to learn how to tune a landscape. So let's just dive right into this paradox. We all naturally assume that human minds work a bit like basic physics, that to move a person, we just need to apply more conversational force. We bring more facts, we get louder, we apply intense pressure. But as you've definitely experienced, usually they just push back harder. Why is that? Why does forcing the issue almost always result in total gridlock? To get to the bottom of this, we've got to look at this totally mind-bending discovery out of the University of Constance. The researchers there published a paper in Nature Materials that challenges a massive 300-year-old physical law by proving the existence of contactless friction. Yeah, literally friction, the force that resists motion, happening without two surfaces ever physically touching each other. It's completely wild. Okay, so to wrap our heads around how contactless friction actually works, we need to talk about a concept called frustration. Seriously, that's the scientific term. In this experiment, researchers looked at these microscopic magnets. They found that energy dissipates not from surfaces rubbing together, but from internal frustration. It's this collective struggle of these tiny magnets constantly flipping back and forth, trying to satisfy completely contradictory forces. The friction isn't coming from the outside, it's entirely generated by internal panic. And this brings us to a concept known as the frustration peak. The results here are super counterintuitive. You'd think the highest resistance would happen at maximum pressure, right? Nope. Peak friction actually happens right in the middle, at an intermediate load, where the system's internal ambiguity and frustration are at their absolute highest. Now, here is where it gets really fascinating. The math behind these frustrated magnets maps perfectly onto human psychology. The physical struggle of a tiny magnet is structurally identical to the cognitive models of how we process information. Resistance in our brains pops up from internal state reconfiguration, exactly like those magnets. Think about it, just like those microscopic magnets desperately scrambling to align, our own cognitive dissonance is, quite simply, internal frustration. When we hold incompatible beliefs, they act as competing constraints. They create this massive amount of internal tension, and our minds naturally seek to dissipate that tension by reconfiguring our attitude so we can just find a stable, comfortable state again. So based on this physics, if maximum resistance lives at the point of maximum frustration, right there at the peak in the middle of our load scale, we have to fundamentally rethink who our most difficult audience actually is. We usually think it's the diehard fanatic, right? The person on the absolute extreme end of a belief. But the physics tells a completely different story. The hardest mind to move with a single push is definitely not the deeply committed believer. It is the ambivalent individual caught in the frustrated middle. Think of someone who is truly torn, maybe a coworker agonizing over two different strategies, or a friend completely stuck on a major life decision. They are perfectly agonizingly balanced between competing constraints. They're experiencing maximum internal ambiguity, which means they're generating maximum internal friction. If you push them directly, you're just adding load near the peak, and they will fight back fiercely. We can actually use this to build a really handy diagnostic framework. Let's contrast the highly defensive, oscillating, frustrated middle with the calm, deeply committed state known as the deep minimum. Just listen to how they speak. The frustrated middle says things like, "I know I should, but," while the deep minimum calmly and fluently restates their position. The frustrated middle wrestles with counter-evidence and gets super defensive because their internal setup is shaky. The deep minimum? They just effortlessly assimilate counter-evidence and stay entirely calm. So, here's the absolutely crucial point. A loud, aggressive, highly defensive argument from someone does not mean they are deeply committed to their belief. Actually, it's quite the opposite. It means their internal configuration is totally shaky, unresolved, and costs them a ton of effort to maintain. The heat is a symptom of frustration, not a symptom of depth. Because cognitive resistance operates exactly like a frustrated energy landscape, applying linear persuasion, just blasting someone with forceful arguments, triggers immediate psychological reactance. People naturally push back. The real game changer is state modulation. State modulation means you shift the invisible constraints around the person, subtly tuning their environment so their cognitive system organically reorients itself into a new, stable state, totally bypassing direct confrontation. All right, so how do we actually use this? Let's say you're pitching a new workflow to your boss, and they're clearly stuck in that frustrated middle. The absolute worst thing you can do is apply more pressure. Pushing harder just adds load right at that friction peak, and it will predictably backfire into a defensive backlash. Instead, your goal is to gently reframe the constraints. You want to offer them a new, tension-free configuration that relieves their internal struggle. Give them a way to slide comfortably into a newly stable state. Conversely, what if you're dealing with someone locked in a deep minimum? You can't argue them out of that deep well. Their internal friction is way too low, and they're too stable. Instead, you've got to introduce a brand new, unshakable constraint. You bypass their defensive boundaries by changing the choices available to them, and you target their core identity. By doing this, you fundamentally warp their cognitive landscape, turning their comfortable, stable well into a highly unstable, jagged hill. And when that deep minimum is successfully destabilized, something really incredible happens. The person enters the transition regime. They literally fall right into the frustrated middle. This means you will suddenly see emotional heat, oscillation, and defensiveness. But, and this is key, this isn't a sign that you're failing. It's a sign of active internal reconfiguration. They are finally wrestling with the constraints. Now, if we want to treat human influence as a rigorous, falsifiable discipline, we can't just retroactively fit this beautiful model to every conversation after the fact. A model that explains everything perfectly in hindsight is basically predicting nothing. We have to actually make predictions. The only way to know if your state modulation is actually working is to practice what's called the falsification discipline. You have to stop reading a static snapshot of a person. Instead, you must commit your guess early. Are they ambivalent or are they committed? And then predict their behavioral response to your intervention before you even make it. Write it down. If they react differently than you predicted, you log the miss. That is how you learn to read the landscape accurately over time. Which brings us to the ultimate diagnostic tool derived straight from the physics lab, the removal test. We have to humbly acknowledge that we are part of the energy field. Any state we observe in someone else is inevitably warped by our own presence, our arguments, and our social pressure. So, how do you know if you've actually changed a mind? You use the removal test. Once you remove yourself, change the subject, or entirely withdraw the pressure, you just watch what happens. If their belief springs right back to its original state, what you achieved wasn't change. It was just temporary, performative compliance coerced by your presence. But if their new belief holds steady, even when you're gone, you've achieved true structural reconfiguration. The new state has stuck. Ultimately, this explainer leaves us with a critical and honestly pretty provocative question to ask ourselves in every negotiation, leadership moment, or debate we enter. Are you actively modulating their state to help them find a new structural reality? Or are you just applying endless friction without a point, hoping they won't spring back the second you leave the room? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and I'll catch you on the next one.